The effects of the war brought Russia to the brink of socio-economic collapse. At the moment, we see the former Soviet-era Russia in the most critical times of the war. Russia and its allies suffered a historic setback due to European economic sanctions as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Never before has it been so difficult for Russian President Vladimir Putin to wage war in Ukraine due to the severe economic restrictions imposed by Ukraine's allies. The Kremlin recklessly risks a massive uprising by Russian citizens, but it has every intention of continuing the conflict. The situation is extremely discouraging for the Russians. Millions of Russians are unemployed, and in major Russian cities such as Moscow and St. Petersburg, resistance and opposition to the regime are on the rise. Protesting Russian citizens, particularly wives and mothers, throng the streets of Moscow. This is a natural consequence of the war sanctions and Putin's irresponsible mobilization. And in his most recent statement, Russian President Vladimir Putin had no choice but to concede that the country's economy had suffered a severe hit. Russia's chaotic economic crisis raises a number of perplexing concerns. Is Russia disintegrating socio-economically? Let's promptly describe the Great Russian Uprising that was overshadowed by the war and economic collapse in Russia. Bogus unemployment reached record levels. The level of underemployment in Russian businesses has reached 5.2 million, surpassing the peak during the pandemic. With no job openings and no employees, the Russian labor market has collapsed due to the mobilization of the population. As a consequence of the sanctions, many restrictions were placed on Russian banks. The Russian people were cut off from international commerce. There has been no raise for retirees in the country, and their salaries are not compensated with mobilized soldiers. All of this indicates that a severe economic downturn is on the horizon in Russia, with severe repercussions for the Kremlin. Many nations, including the United States and the United Kingdom, impose severe sanctions on Russia, particularly Belgium, the United Kingdom, and the European Union. Sanctions that impede the Russian economy are on the agenda. The United Kingdom imposes the greatest number of sanctions on Russia. Japan and Australia have the least amount of sanctions. Correspondingly, the European Union on the other side imposed the greatest number of sanctions, 705. Switzerland was another nation that attracted attention with 774 sanctions. The Belgian government has set a new record with 250 billion euros in sequestered Russian assets, including those registered on the Belgian Euroclear platform. In this regard, the Russian government attempted to exert pressure on Belgium and the EU, but without success. In contrast, the most recent British sanctions targeted 130 Russian oligarchs with a combined net worth of $173 billion. The Kremlin was stunned by the greatest package of sanctions imposed by the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom was officially determined to economically isolate Russia. Dmitry Peskov, spokesman for the Kremlin, told reporters that the United Kingdom and other countries that imposed sanctions on Russian assets must lift them immediately and unconditionally. In a report published last week, Moscow stated that the country's economy contracted by 1.9% in the first quarter of 2023. Repo provided evidence supporting this allegation. This group continues to monitor Russia's economic situation second by second. In contrast, Western sanctions have had an unprecedentedly negative impact on the Russian economy, and Russia is presently facing a staggering $50 billion budget deficit. Economic measures and export restrictions appear to compel Russia to furnish its soldiers with household appliances. Alexander Prokopenko, a former official of the Russian Central Bank who fled the country shortly after the outbreak of the war, stated in a statement that the Russian economy had entered a protracted decline in response to the news that the country's youth had been sent to the front or fled. The labor force shrank. Putin's partial mobilization decision had a negative effect on the economy, and half of the business sector began to experience personnel issues. Since the pre-war era, Russia has been subjected to a total of 14,022 sanctions. Russia left Iran with this number of sanctions, Syria with this number, and North Korea with this number. On the other hand, its plan to collect income tax from the frozen assets of the Central Bank of the Russian Federation in the EU, it was previously reported, did that. European officials feared legal risks in case of a direct transfer of frozen Russian assets to Ukraine. Recall that Estonia was the first of the EU countries that planned to transfer the money of the Russian oligarchs to Ukraine. Estonian authorities have developed a system that allows Russians to sell their detained assets and send their proceeds to the Ukrainian side. Prolonged debates within the European Union regarding the mechanism to use frozen Russian assets in favor of Ukraine resulted in a specific plan that was tentatively supported by the leaders of European countries. The plan provides for the collection of income tax on frozen assets of the Central Bank of the Russian Federation. We are talking about creating a tax in excess of 200 billion euros on excess income from assets of the Central Bank of the Russian Federation. Interest and tax revenues, amounting to about 3 billion euros per year, will be transferred to the restoration of Ukraine. Most of the frozen Russian assets are in cash and deposits. The rest is in securities planned to be liquidated in the next 2 to 3 years. EU representatives have already discussed such a mechanism with the US presidential administration and have informed American allies about the progress in this regard. The leaders of European countries are considering the support of all G7 members. The agency also emphasizes that the plan in question can be challenged in court. Some sources claim that the interest and income plan to be received under this mechanism come from sanctions assets and ultimately belong to the Russian side. One of the interlocutors of the organization states that the issue of using the frozen assets of the Russian Federation is still difficult, as there is no mature proposal that can be accepted at the legislative level. In this direction, we can say that the Russian economy is heading towards a collapse that could overthrow the Putin regime. Analysts, on the other hand, calculated that a one-day war against Ukraine cost the Russian budget $1 billion. The Russian economy, despite the illusion of stability, is headed for a collapse that could topple the regime of Vladimir Putin. The one-day war against Ukraine cost the Russian budget $1 billion. The Kremlin is raising billions of dollars from raw material exports to finance the invasion. But since Western sanctions, Russia's energy prices have fallen and Russia's barely surviving by supplying the Asian market with heavily discounted oil. Against this background, the Russian authorities levy brutal taxes and rob their own people to continue the war in Ukraine. Such moves discredit Putin in Russian society and at the same time weaken his power. It is not surprising that neither the people nor the elite of the Russian Federation rallied around the Lord of the Kremlin during the attempted armed uprising organized by the Wagner PMC leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin. Analysts point out that losing wars goes hand in hand with economic turmoil and regime change in Russia. Although economic recession is rarely the only reason for an overthrow of power, it's emphasized that its serious importance in the overthrow of tyrannical regimes should not be ignored, especially in terms of financing the war. On the other hand, since the beginning of this year, the ruble has consistently weakened against the dollar and euro after abnormal prices in 2022. In recent days, the Russian currency has accelerated its decline against the backdrop of an armed insurgency in the Russian Federation. And even though the military coup attempt has been stopped, the ruble continues to fall slowly. The dollar traded on Moscow Stock Exchange exceeded 89 rubles and the euro exceeded 97 rubles. According to economic observers, The dollar may cost 100 rubles in the near future and later, even possibly 200 rubles, which seems quite realistic. The Russian treasury is starting to run into a shortage of money to fulfill all the government's promises. But with the new ruble rate, the treasury deficit does not seem so critical in this regard. The Russian authorities have no other means except for the devaluation of the Russian currency. Experts also remind that the large budget deficit in the Russian Federation ended with events similar to 1991 or 1998. That is, with a change of power. Therefore, all fiscal policy in Russia is aimed at maintaining balance by any means. In addition, the end of the tax period also puts pressure on the ruble on the last day. So how is Putin cannibalizing the Russian economy for personal survival? At the start of the 18th month of Russia's invasion of Ukraine amid last week's failed coup attempt, battlefield setbacks, and global diplomatic condemnation, Russia has turned into a minefield. The invasion of Ukraine has cost Russia dearly. Russia, which is constantly experiencing explosions, has turned into a place of fire. Russian fire brigades are struggling to control the fires. What is happening in Russia, which is experiencing the most difficult days of its history? Faced with many explosions, different claims are put forward for the explosions in Russia. Why do you think these explosions are happening? Let's examine them together. The Russian army was planning to wage the Ukraine-Russia war on Ukraine's territory. Putin did not want the war to spread to his territory because this could have been a risk for Putin, who wanted to save his political reputation. But the situation did not turn out the way Russia wanted. Sounds of explosions are coming from all over Russia, and Putin is unable to resist all these explosions. Today, another fire broke out in a major shopping center in Russia. 3 days ago, there was a fire in another big shopping center in Moscow. These back-to-back fires are worrying all Russian people. People want an end to this situation. Emergency services in Moscow are taking care of those injured in the fires and explosions. On the other hand, another fire broke out in a building in the town of Balashikha today. After the fire, the roof of the Story Track shopping center collapsed. This has increased security measures in many other shopping centers. All shopping centers are protected by high-level security measures. On the other hand, the cause of these fires in shopping centers is unknown. But the fires start during the hours when the shopping centers are closed. This is quite surprising because civilians are not harmed by the fire. It is the shopping centers that suffer. Of course, the Russian economy also suffers. The Russian people are in great panic because of these fires. The number of people going to the shopping center in Russia is decreasing day by day. The Russian economy is experiencing the worst days in its history. The Russian ruble is losing value day by day as New Year's Eve approaches. Many squares in Russia are decorated with Christmas trees. However, many streets were closed. Many big shops closed their shutters because the war has caused great damage to the Russian economy and many businesses have gone bankrupt. With bigger and bigger fires every day, Russia is bringing more and more companies to bankruptcy. The Russian economy is falling rapidly day by day. These explosions in Russia did not only occur in shopping malls in the past days, there were explosions at 2 military bases belonging to the Russian army. One of them was the airport where Russian airplanes were maintained. Many fighter jets of the Russian army were damaged. The other explosion occurred at a fuel tanker near the military base. The Russian fire brigade had a hard time putting out the fires. The fires could not be extinguished for hours. On the other hand, big explosions are also taking place in the regions occupied by Russia. The biggest of these was the explosion of the governor of Kherson region. The governor of the region was injured in a car explosion in Kherson in southern Ukraine. The regional governor, Vitaly Berlyuk, was seriously injured in this explosion. The driver of the car was killed. Many Russian bureaucrats in these regions are frightened by the attacks. Attacks on Russian bureaucrats are increasing. Russia pays double salaries to bureaucrats working in this region. But despite this, no Russian bureaucrat wants to work here. Working in this region could mean giving up their lives. On the other hand, Russian bureaucrats are aware that these regions will be liberated by Ukraine. In that case, no one thinks that Russia will win the war. No one wants to take sides in a losing war. The Ukrainian army is doing its best to liberate the territories occupied by Russia. Successful operations are being conducted in the region. The latest of these operations took place today in Melitopol. There were many Russian soldiers in Melitopol. The Ukrainian army organized a major attack on the Russian military bases here. The Russian army, which suffered great losses in the last 24 hours, suffered one of the biggest losses in its history. Russia, which lost over 500 soldiers, became desperate. The Russian army suffered heavy losses in the attack organized with HIMARS. The Ukrainian army carried out a major operation in the Russian bases in Melitopol. Thanks to the HIMARS, many Russian bases were destroyed. HIMARS became an important tool in changing the course of the war. The HIMARS sent by the United States to the Ukrainian army were of great use in the Ukraine-Russia war. These war tools, which have a great power of destruction, play an important role in the course of the war. HIMARS combat vehicles can fire 6 missiles simultaneously. These missiles travel up to 80 kilometers. This range covers a very large area. Such a large range of HIMARS puts the Russian army in a very difficult situation. On the other hand, HIMARS can change location very quickly after launching a missile. It is very difficult for the Russian army to destroy HIMARS, which can maneuver quickly. For this reason, Ukraine is conducting major operations against Russia with HIMARS. Russia, which is heavily damaged, cannot do anything about it. HIMARS have a great impact power. These large combat vehicles have a very high hit rate. With such a powerful fighting tool, Ukraine gains an incredible advantage over Russia. The tide of the war is changing thanks to HIMARS. But HIMARS are not enough for the explosions in Russia because the range of these war tools is 80 kilometers. Have the burning Russian tanker burned is still a matter of curiosity. Russian authorities continue to investigate this situation. On the other hand, the Russian press claims that this explosion was caused by Ukrainian drums. The drums used by Ukraine against Russia are called Bayraktar drones, which can fly at very high altitudes, cannot be tracked by Russian radars. The drones, which can overcome Russian air defenses, have great operational capability. It is claimed that critical attacks in Russia may have been carried out by these drones. However, Ukraine does not accept these attacks. Many Ukrainian bureaucrats say that the attacks did not take place. The Ukrainian military also does not claim responsibility for these attacks. So where are these attacks originating from? Russia is not making a statement about the attacks. Russian officials state that investigations into the attack are ongoing. The reason for not making a statement yet is quite simple. The political reputation of the Putin administration is falling day by day. Putin, who does not want to lose face, wants to prevent a major crisis. If it is understood that the Ukrainian army is operating inside Russia, this could cause a major crisis in Russia. Putin, whose influence is diminishing day by day, does not want such a situation. This could go down in history as an intelligence failure. The Russian government wants to hide this. It does not want it to be known that it has suffered heavy blows against Ukraine. But all these efforts are futile. Russia continues to take heavy blows against Ukraine with explosions every day. Russia is certain to lose this war, claiming to have one of the most powerful armies in the world. Russia was threatening the whole world. However, with the resistance of the Ukrainian army, it became clear that Russia was not that strong. Ukraine is actually facing a very weak Russia. This has had a huge impact on Russia and other states. Thanks to Ukraine's victories, the whole world now knows that Russia is not strong. No country in the world is afraid of Russia anymore. The whole world is facing a weak Russia. On the other hand, the balance of power in the world has changed as the true strength of the Russian army has been revealed. Russia is losing important allies. China, Russia's biggest and most important ally, has left Russia alone by not supporting Russia in the war. A Chinese company has canceled a deal to send military computer chips to the Russian army. The Ukraine-Russia war has driven a wedge between China and Russia. China wants to become the new leader of the Eastern countries after Russia. With the war in Ukraine, the rivalry between Russia and China is growing. Rorschach, which was established after the collapse of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, has been considered the most powerful and largest state in the Eastern countries since the Cold War. However, Russia's big blow against Ukraine has changed this. Russia's collapse is only a matter of time. It is known that NATO is preparing for a possible collapse of Russia. In such a case, NATO could confiscate Russia's nuclear weapons. The whole world wants to reduce nuclear weapons. The confiscation of nuclear weapons in Russia could be a turning point for the whole world. The collapse of Russia could be a new beginning that would change the global powers. The historic resistance of the Ukrainian army could be one of the most important turning points in the world. Ukraine is doing everything it can to win this war. Many war experts say that Ukraine will carry out a major operation when the winter is over. The whole fate of the war may depend on this operation. This operation could end the war and lead to the collapse of Russia. The Ukrainian army plans to completely liberate the territories occupied by Russia in 2014. Crimea, which faced Russia's occupation in 2014, is one of these territories. The Ukrainian army managed to get closer to Crimea after liberating the Kherson region. Russia fears that Ukraine, which has blown up many Russian bases, will launch attacks in this region. For this reason, it has taken many measures. Russia has dug many pits and trenches close to Crimea to prevent HIMARS from approaching Crimea. What happens in Crimea could change the fate of the whole war. If the Ukrainian army manages to liberate Crimea, Russia will suffer a major defeat. This will change the fate of Putin and Russia. Many war experts speak of Crimea as the place where the knot of the war will be untied. Crimea will decide the fate of everything. What do you think about the fires in Russia? What do you think is the source of the fires on Russian territory? Do you think Russia can win this war? What do you think will happen in the future of Crimea? How will China's ambitions take shape? There is some good news in the Boulder area. The Ukrainians capitalized on their yesterday's counterattack and developed their success further. The Russians were pushed from the city along multiple vectors, and right now the Ukrainians are preparing for a decisive push in the countryside. Losing it would mean that the Russian offensive completely failed and they would need to start from scratch, but without the element of surprise. Last time I told you that the Russians took control of the countryside south of Woldor, burned the hospital buildings on the corner of the city, using thermobaric artillery, and then under cover of smoke and supporting fire, entered the city. I also told you that the Ukrainians conducted a counterattack and crushed Russian flanks from the north. The counterattack was successful. The Ukrainians established control over half of the countryside and completely immobilized the Russians. The latest report suggests that the Russians initially planned to assault the city at night, but because they were now forced to engage in positional fights, the plan was disrupted and they stayed in one place. The Ukrainians took advantage of the situation and reinforced the leader even more. As a result, Russian sources started reporting that assaulting Ukrainian positions became infeasible. One source claimed that the concentration is higher than 3 companies per 1 kilometer. Ukrainian artillery has also adjusted and is engaging in counter-battery combat, as well as the support of the infantry near the city. For example, due to the heavy fire and the invisibility of developing an offensive operation, the Russians have reportedly abandoned the hospital and even the southern countryside. This countryside is comprised of around 24 sparsely located houses, and given the winter conditions, there is simply no place to hide. In order to reduce disciplined support of the main assault group that is still maintaining a presence in the northern countryside, Ukrainian artillery is targeting the areas of forces concentrations in Pavlovka, Mikhailovsky, and other settlements. Some sources suggest that the Ukrainians also used HIMARS to target warehouses with equipment tens of kilometers behind the zero line in order to prevent further escalation of the Russian offensive. So far, the Ukrainians managed to break the momentum, undermine the stability of Russian positions that they wanted to use to develop their offensive, and ensure that the city was under full Ukrainian control. This is the third day in a row where the Ukrainian General Staff is reporting around 800 Russians killed per day. And although the number concerns the whole front line, it has significantly increased since the Russians launched their attacks in the Zaporizhia region. If the Ukrainians manage to push the Russians out of this northern countryside, it will be a complete failure for the Russians and they will need to abort the mission. However, a lot of analysts started speculating, Ukrainian, Western as well as Russian, that the Russians did not launch this series of attacks in the Zaporizhia region to win. The main goal of these attacks may be to draw Ukrainian forces to this region and make sure that they keep forces in all 4 regions by sporadically attacking along the whole contact line in order to undermine Ukrainian capabilities in the Donbas region. The reason why they decided to prioritize the Luhansk region likely lies in the quality of troops that they allocated there. The Ukrainians got very close to Kremenna and Svatov, meaning once Western tanks arrived, it would be much easier to create a breakthrough here than in Zaporizhia in order to preserve at least some buffer. The Russians started deploying their most trained and professional troops, which they do not want to lose. One of the ways to achieve it would be applying pressure from the south, because in the south they have recently relocated a lot of mobilized soldiers that they can afford to lose. And judging by the footage of the attacks in the right direction, it loosely fits the description, because demobilized soldiers here were sent through the fields almost with no equipment and very little artillery support. The same cannot be said about, although our probability of failure here is very high. If joined, the forces away from the east is really the goal. And some sources do indicate that certain troops were sent from Druzhkivka. Such a costly strategy will further demoralize Russian soldiers and undermine any future operation in this region, whether this offensive or defensive, because the soldiers understand that they are expendable. If the Ukrainians manage to retain control over key positions while waiting for the proper conditions for the next counteroffensive, such a climate inside the Russian army will help the Ukrainians to breach Russian defense more easily and penetrate defensive orders more deeply.